Thank you for taking the time out of your day to be here for my dissertation proposal. The title of my proposal is Self-Regulation and Behavioral Expectation for Translating Resistance Training Intention into Behavior. Some of the background information that I'll go into are the health benefits of resistance training as well as the prevalence of those meeting the resistance training recommendations. I will cover questions for behavioral research as it relates to my proposed research. And I will cover my specific aims and hypotheses as well as the proposed methods to carry out the study. Resistance training is a form of exercise that has a plethora of health benefits. Resistance training can help increase bone mineral density, can improve lean body mass, strengthen endurance, it can improve insulin sensitivity, it can decrease the risk of falls as well as osteoporosis, and it's useful for reducing body fat levels. Resistance training also improves functional capacity, cardiovascular health, it can improve resting blood pressure and blood lipid profiles, and it can improve mental health as well. The CDC recommends that individuals engage in resistance training 2 times per week. Despite the health benefits, only 30.5% of the country is meeting the recommendations. When we break it down by age, we see that as individuals get older, there are less people that are meeting that 2 times per week guideline. We also see that there is a steep decline in participation as individuals transition from the 18 to 24 group to the 25 to 34 group, and that decline is steeper than in any other transition from one age category to the other. And we've seen that in 2011, 2013, 2015, and 2017. So if there are plenty of health benefits, but the prevalence is so low, how can we have individuals engage in more resistance training? And this leads to the questions for behavioral research as it relates to the proposed research. This is taken from a 2016 paper by William and colleagues. They say, given the health benefits of resistance training and low prevalence rates, the development and testing of resistance training promotion interventions are needed. Use of mediator analysis in the context of such resistance training intervention research can tell us not only whether or not the intervention worked, but what intermediary targets of behavior change were successfully changed in the intervention, which of these targets were predictive of behavior change regardless of whether they were successfully changed through the intervention, and through which intermediary targets the intervention exerted its effects. And Williams and colleagues state that the above information is invaluable for optimizing the design of future resistance training interventions. So with this in mind, questions that I would have that would relate to the research that I propose is, one, which determinants are predictive of behavior? So what determinants predict resistance training behavior? And then what determinants of behavior change were successfully changed in intervention? For example, if I wanted to target a determinant, is the behavior change technique that I use successful at improving that determinant? And then also, is the intervention viable for changing behavior? If we target determinants of resistance training or correlates of resistance training and they change, does that also change behavior? In 2017, Rhodes and colleagues conducted a systematic review that examined the psychological correlates of participation in resistance training behavior. When looking at the intrapersonal correlates of resistance training, there was positive associations with affective judgments, self-efficacy, self-regulatory behaviors, and then also with intention. In physical activity research, it's been examined that there is an intention behavior gap. That is, individuals do not always act on their intentions. We see this in resistance training as well. So several studies found no association with intention and behavior. Minimal but significant associations or also indirect associations with intention and behavior. There's a possibility that there may be a gap in identifying other constructs between intention and behavior, and this would be useful to add in conceptual models. So what can help bridge that gap between intention and behavior? Self-regulation may be one of those important variables to consider in models. So self-regulation, Rhodes and colleagues state in 2017 that self-regulation behaviors such as planning and self-monitoring are important for people to start participating in resistance training. Thus, models that use self-regulation behavior constructs should be given consideration in resistance training promotion. So what we have affective judgment, self-efficacy, and intention all as being related to resistance training, but we also see that self-regulatory behaviors are also related to participating in resistance training. So models that include that would be beneficial. One model that does include planning components, so self-regulation components, is that the health action process approach. It includes action planning, volitional self-efficacy, and coping planning. This diagram is based off of a 2019 meta-analysis of the health action process approach by Zan and colleagues, and this was used for all health-related behaviors. So it wasn't just used for exercise, it was used for exercise and nutrition behaviors. The health action process approach is a model that was designed by Ralph Schwartzer, and the health action process approach presents a mediator model which allows for the prediction of behavior and explains the assumed causal mechanisms of behavior change. Schwartzer states that different research questions may employ more parsimonious models of the health action process approach. He considers the health action process approach to be an open architectural framework that serves to guide research and practice. Therefore, studies may vary in the number and type of constructs that they employ. Now, because of the flexibility of this model to include certain constructs, for example, we see affective attitude as being related to resistance training, the health action process approach seems to be a viable model for explaining resistance training behavior and addressing that first question, which is what correlates are related to resistance training behavior. What I would propose is a model that looks like this. This modification of the health action process approach includes the correlates that have been observed to be related to resistance training behavior, including self-regulation in the form of coping planning, intention, affective attitudes, and task self-efficacy. Behavioral expectation is the likelihood of a person's perceptions of the likelihood of engaging in a behavior despite barriers. Now, a quick overview of all of these definitions of the correlates of resistance training participation. I just covered behavioral expectation, but affective attitudes are the positive or negative feelings derived from the activity. Intention is a variable that captures the motivational factors that influence a behavior and indicate how hard people are willing to try or how much effort they're willing to exert in order to perform a behavior. Coping planning is a barrier-focused self-regulation strategy. It represents a mental link between anticipated risk situations and suitable coping responses. And task self-efficacy refers to beliefs about capabilities to exercise control over behaviors. Moving on to the next question is, what determinants of behavior change were successfully changed in interventions? I will draw from 3 randomized control trials where the researchers attempted to intervene on some of the constructs that I have already mentioned. The first one is a 2012 study by Lubins. So Lubins and colleagues had their participants significantly increase their resistance training planning strategies. Participants in this study were randomized to either a resistance training group or to a non-resistance training group. The resistance training group was the group that received the intervention. The researchers intervened on a variety of constructs. I'll draw your attention to the resistance training planning strategies in this case. So they had personal trainers that met with all the participants. Personal trainers encouraged participants to plan their resistance training sessions and to self-monitor their behavior to ensure that they completed all necessary sessions. This included the identification of strategies to overcome barriers and the formation of plans to overcome barriers. In this case, Lubins and colleagues were using coping planning. In their study, the control group actually reduced scores on their RT planning strategies, whereas the intervention group increased their scores. In 2016, Williams found that participants in high-dose resistance training promotion interventions had more positive changes from time 1 to time 2 than participants in a low-dose intervention in behavioral expectations and also in coping planning. Here's an outline that's similar to Lubins's review or Lubins's paper. For behavioral expectations, individuals in the high-dose condition received ongoing encouragement to exercise 2 times per week and an online assessment of behavioral expectations, whereas the low dose did not receive any intervention on that construct. The high-dose condition in the for self-regulation received online problem-solving, barrier and strategy approach, online selection of strategies to overcome barriers, report strategies, receive feedback, stick with, or choose new strategies. Whereas the low-dose condition received just a brief print manual about problem-solving and barrier strategies. Millens and Bray intervened on technique self-efficacy and adherence self-efficacy. In their experimental group, they were able to enhance both of those constructs. What we have so far is evidence that we may be able to enhance self-regulatory skills, and we also may be able to enhance technique self-efficacy. Prior to going over the analysis of their study, Williams and colleagues write, taken together, these studies show little consistent support for the malleability, predictive power, and mediation of social cognitive constructs, with the possible exception of some self-regulatory strategies. So this paper also comes back to the importance of self-regulatory strategies such as planning. So far, we see that planning may be one of the self-regulatory strategies that are we're able to change with behavior change techniques. Next question would be, is the intervention viable for changing behaviors? So what Williams and colleagues found was that changes in self-regulation mediated the effects of the intervention onto behavior. They also found that changes in behavioral expectation nearly satisfied the criteria for mediation. Lubins and colleagues found that changes in intention to plan for resistance training mediated the effects of the intervention onto behavior as well. Rhodes and colleagues have since recommended that resistance training intervention should include strategies to target these key variables. Task and barrier self-efficacy might be especially important considerations. People need to feel confident to do resistance training behaviors. Self-regulation behaviors such as planning and self-monitoring, this is a repeat, are important for people to start participating in resistance training. Thus, models that use self-regulation behavior constructs should be given consideration in resistance training promotion. Based on the background so far, we see that self-regulation and self-efficacy are important constructs to intervene on. They are modifiable through interventions, and they are predictive of behavior change. And when we change these constructs, it may be that we also change behavior. Move on to the specific aims and hypotheses. I'm proposing to conduct 2 studies that will aim to address those three questions that I covered earlier. In study 1, seek to examine the effectiveness of a conceptual model based on the health action process approach, which includes affective attitudes, task self-efficacy, intention, coping planning, and behavioral expectation influences on intention and resistance training behavior. It's hypothesized that task self-efficacy, affective attitudes, and behavioral expectation will predict intentions. It's hypothesized that intention, coping planning, and behavioral expectation will predict behavior. And it's hypothesized that the relationship between intention and behavior will also be partially mediated by coping planning and behavioral expectations. And to show this again, this is the proposed model for the first research study. This is the model that we'll aim to test. Moving on to study 2. Study 2 has 2 specific aims. We seek to examine if task self-efficacy, behavioral expectations, and coping planning are subject to change in a resistance training intervention. And a hypothesis is that all participants will enhance their task self-efficacy with guided practice. Participants in the guided coaching group, which will occur after randomization, will enhance their behavioral expectation and coping planning. The second aim of this study is to test if participants who receive a behaviorally enhanced resistance training intervention, which addresses behavioral expectations and coping planning, engage in more resistance training sessions than those who receive a usual care resistance training intervention. And the hypothesis is that the enhanced guided coaching intervention group, which includes resistance training plus guided coaching, will engage in significantly more resistance training sessions than the usual care group, which will only receive resistance training. Moving on to the proposed methods. We'll start out with study 1. Once again, the purpose of study 1 is to test a conceptual model in a non-clinical healthy population. Healthy will be defined as individuals without serious injury, long-term physical incapacity, or suffering from rehabilitating from chronic conditions and risk factors that require medication. Participants will be college students and faculty from a university in the New England region. Healthy adults aged 18 to 35 who have participated in resistance training at least one time in the past 4 weeks will be considered eligible for this study. The sample size is going to be based on recommendations from structural equation modeling research. Klein suggests that samples with less than 100 participants are considered small, those between 100 and 200 are medium, and samples with 200 or more are considered large. It's also recommended that there are 10 participants for each parameter. With 5 estimated parameters, a sample size of 50 or more participants would be needed for analysis. Furthermore, based on the effect size of coping planning and physical activity research, an a priori power analysis using a medium to large effect size was completed, and it was deemed that 89 participants would be necessary. Factoring in a potential dropout of 20% and the recommendations of Klein, the study will aim to recruit 120 participants. Participants will be recruited through several active and passive recruitment strategies. This will include classroom visits, poster placement, and through campus-wide email. Passive recruitment techniques will include placing posters by high traffic areas, such as the gym changing rooms, outside of the student gym, and by water fountains in the student gym. Interested participants will be instructed to email the lead investigator to receive the Qualtrics eligibility survey. Campus-wide emails will also be sent out with an attached Qualtrics eligibility survey. The eligibility survey will ask participants how old they are. It will probe them for their resistance training status. It will have them fill out a PAR-Q, and if they are deemed eligible, they'll fill out an informed consent online. Once participants consent, they'll be sent right to the survey. The initial survey will measure task self-efficacy, affective attitudes, intentions, behavioral expectations, and coping planning. The follow-up to this study will be conducted 2 weeks after the initial survey. Behavior will be assessed using the International Physical Activity Questionnaire. This questionnaire will ask participants to report the number of days of resistance training they participated in the last week and the average duration in minutes per week. So 2 of these surveys will be sent out to measure resistance training over the course of 2 weeks. Participants who complete the last follow-up survey will be sent a $10 Amazon gift card. We can begin in analyzing the predictions of intentions, behavioral expectations, and coping planning once the first survey comes in. And this would be the model that we would test. With the inclusion of behavior 2 weeks later, this is the model that we would test, which is the original model that I had shown. This study would address what correlates are related to resistance training participation. Moving on to study 2. Here's an overview of the design of study 2. Study 2 will be conducted in 2 phases. Primarily, one will be guided resistance training, which will occur for sessions 1 and 2. At the conclusion of session 2, participants will be randomized. Both groups will receive an educational packet and will be prescribed unsupervised resistance training. However, the experimental group will receive behavioral coaching sessions at the end of session 2, 4, and 6. And here's a quick overview of measurement time points. At the end of the first session, we will measure task self-efficacy and affective attitude. At the end of the second session, prior to randomization, we will measure all of the constructs. After randomization, at the end of the third session, we will measure intention, behavioral expectations, coping planning, and at the end of the 8th session, we'll measure all constructs. Prior to recruitment, we'll need to train student personal trainers. So student volunteers with personal training experience will be recruited by the principal investigator to be trained to serve as personal trainers for the studies, and we will recruit up to 3 student volunteers. Moving on to recruitment. We will recruit participants in a similar way to the first study via those active and passive recruitment strategies. We'll seek to recruit up to 47 participants. A power analysis was completed using G-Power 3.1 with a medium to large effect size, and that gave us 47 participants. Factoring in dropout, we'll aim to recruit up to 60. And this is in line with previous randomized control trials. For example, Lubin's and colleagues used 48 participants. Millen and Bray used 41 participants. Williams and colleagues is the exception. They recruited 123 participants. To assess eligibility, we will ask participants about their age, resistance training status, and they'll also fill out a PAR-Q. So participants are 18 to 35, and if they have no contraindications, and if they have been doing resistance training on average less than 1 time per week in the last 4 weeks, they will be eligible for the survey. If they're eligible, they'll provide their email and cell phone number, and they will be contacted by the primary investigator to set up their guided resistance training practice. Now again, the resistance training intervention will be broken down into 2 phases. During the first phase, all participants will receive guided instructions. When participants come in for their first session, they'll sign an informed consent. They will be given a resistance training logbook from their personal trainer. The resistance training logbook will be used to write down all of the exercises that they are doing, as well as the weight that they're using, as well as the repetitions that they will be using. At this point, the personal trainers will be leading the sessions. The American College of Sports Medicine recommends unilateral and bilateral, single and multiple joint resistance training exercises with an emphasis on multiple joint exercises for maximizing overall muscle strength in novices. For novices, both free weight and machine-based training is recommended in a repetition range of 8 to 12 for 1 to 3 sets per exercise. The design for the resistance training program was based on these recommendations. Prior to beginning the resistance training program, the participants will all engage in a full body warm-up, and these are some of the exercises that they will use. Again, the resistance training program is based on the recommendations from the American College of Sports Medicine. These exercises will train the whole body and primarily are multiple joint exercises. Training exercises will consist of 3 sets of 10 repetitions for each exercise, and participants will rest 60 to 90 seconds between sets. In order to control how challenging the exercises are, we will ask participants to work in a 4 to 6 RPE range using the modified Borg scale, or a 12 to 15 RPE range using the Borg scale. Participants will complete this training program under the guided supervision of a personal trainer on 2 separate occasions that will be separated by 24 hours. At the end of those 2 sessions, they will have filled out each of these measures. The measures for the exercises that specifically examine specific exercises for task self-efficacy will have images next to them so that participants can be reminded of the exercises that they were doing. All measures will be conducted in private, and the primary investigator as well as the personal trainers will not be there. This is an example of the task self-efficacy for the dumbbell press. Participants will be asked about their confidence to do exercises with proper body positioning, the appropriate amount of resistance, and also the correct movement. At the end of session 2, and after participants have completed all of their measures, they'll be randomized into either the experimental group or the control group. Regardless of which group the participants are in, they will receive a printed educational packet on the health benefits of resistance training, along with a printout of each exercise they have done with detailed instructions. They will also be allowed to keep their resistance training notebook. The resistance training for the second phase of the program will be identical to the first, and that won't be different between the 2 groups. The difference is that now the resistance training will be self-guided. All participants will be given a schedule of open hours for which they can return to do resistance training. And both groups will be informed that after the 3-week period, which will comprise of the other 6 sessions, is complete, that they'll be given the option to sign up for additional training sessions as a thank you for participation, in which they will learn new exercises. Once again, the control group will just continue with usual care. They will have received their educational packet, open hours, and then the training notebook where they can write down what they've been doing. The experimental group will undergo behavioral coaching. They'll undergo behavioral coaching with a specific focus on enhancing behavioral expectations and then coping planning as well. For the participants who have been randomized to the experimental group, they will receive a planning notebook that looks something like this. In brief, and we'll go over this for each individual point, these will be the scripts for the behavioral coaching intervention, and we'll cover that now. Individuals in the experimental group will practice time management. The script will read this, and this will be for their notebook. It'll say you're recently given a notebook. Take a few minutes to fill in your weekly schedule in your notebook. Include classes you may have, work, and known obligations. Once everything is filled in, we can discuss best times for you to complete your resistance training. At this point, we'll have participants fill in their schedule and check to make sure that everything is filled in accurately. This would be an example of what a Monday might look like, where they're planning in their classes, their lunch, if they have any school activities, or when they're leaving campus. Any work commitments will be added as well. Once this is done, we want to form an action plan. The action plan will be based on when participants can come in to do resistance training. They'll look at their schedule and they'll think of when is the best time that they can come in to do resistance training. They'll be giving an example. An example would be, after my biology class, I will go to the gym to do my resistance training. Whenever they plan to do resistance training, they'll write down their action plan in the right-hand corner, and they'll also fill in when they plan on coming to do resistance training in their planner. Participants are also going to be given the opportunity to receive a text message, a reminder text message for when their session is. The reminder text message will also include pervasive encouragement. Participants will select when they would like to receive a reminder for each resistance training session that they had planned. So for example, they might request a reminder 24 hours ahead of time. We will include a customized pervasive encouragement message. So for example, would be, you can do it, with an exclamation point, see you then. In order to focus on coping planning, which again, coping planning is a barrier-focused self-regulation strategy which represents a mental link between anticipated risk situations and suitable coping responses, participants will take their daily planner and they'll identify barriers to engaging in resistance training and then write out plans to work around these barriers. This is what the coping planning script looks like. We'll say, at this point, you may have noticed that unexpected things get in the way of us following through with our plans. Maybe you get busy with schoolwork or are called in to work a longer shift. It's useful to make plans to work around these barriers that we may have. For example, maybe there are 2 free hours in your day to do resistance training, and you took the latter option, but were then asked to do work that day. A good plan would be to take advantage of your other option. If this doesn't work, another plan might mean rescheduling your time for another day. We'll encourage participants to take a few minutes to think about the barriers that may keep them from doing resistance training and write them down. Once they've written down the barriers, we will work together to develop solutions to work around these barriers. Have them write that down on the planning sheet and then transition that over to their training notebook or their daily notebook. A coping plan might look like this. If I cannot make my resistance training session on Monday, I will email my coach and schedule a time to come in on Tuesday. So now action plans and coping plans have been also made. We'll also encourage participants to take all of the information that they put in their daily planner and translate over their resistance training sessions to whatever electronic calendar that they may use. And then again, as another reminder, each of these coaching sessions will happen at the end of session 2 after randomization, at the end of session 4, and also at the end of session 6. Based on these results, there will be several analyses that we'll be doing. So the first is changes in self-efficacy, coping planning, and then also behavioral expectations. In the first phase of the analysis, we will test the effects of condition on changes from time 3 through time 5 on coping planning and behavioral expectations. And then regardless of condition, and this is because both conditions will receive the same behavior change technique for test self-efficacy, we will track changes in test self-efficacy from time 1 through time 5. We'll also conduct a repeated measures ANOVA to analyze differences in task self-efficacy scores for all groups at all measurement points. A repeated measures ANOVA will also be run for coping planning and behavioral expectations at all measured time points. So this is asking the question, did the behavior change techniques change the constructs that were targeted? You also want to analyze if there's differences between the groups. An independent samples t-test will be run to determine differences in mean scores between the self-regulation group, which is the enhanced behavioral coaching group, and the control group at the conclusion of the study for all constructs, including behavior. When you take the two studies that I proposed together, the first study will address question number 1. Which determinants of behavior are predictive of behavior change regardless of whether they were successfully changed through an intervention? In this case, we're not actually aiming to change anything. What determinants of behavior change were successfully changed in the intervention? This will be addressed in my second study. Were we able to actually change task self-efficacy, behavioral expectations, and coping planning? And then, is the intervention viable for changing behavior? Did the individuals in the guided coaching group engage in more resistance training than those in the control group, which just underwent usual care?